2. The depth to hear and the length to walk. A Burmese elephant has the same set of genes whether it toils in a lodging camp or runs free in the forest. But its DNA will not tell you the details of its life. In the same way, electrons cannot tell us what is most interesting about electricity. Like elephants, electricity has been forced to bear our burdens and move great loads, and we have worked out more or less precisely its behavior while in captivity. But we must not be fooled into believing we know everything important about the lives of its wild cousins. What is the source of thunder and lightning that causes clouds to become electrified and discharge their fury upon the earth? Science still doesn't know. Why does the earth have a magnetic field? What makes combed hair frizzy, nylon cling, and party balloons stick to walls? This most common of all electrical phenomena is still not well understood. How does our brain work, our nerves function, our cells communicate? How is our body's growth choreographed? We are still fundamentally ignorant, and the question raised in this book, what is the effect of electricity on life, is one that modern science doesn't even ask. Science's only concern today is to keep human exposure below a level that will cook your cells. The effect of non-lethal electricity is something mainstream science no longer wants to know. But in the 18th century, scientists not only asked the question, but began to supply answers. Early friction machines were capable of being charged to about 10,000 volts, enough to deliver a stinging shock, but not enough then or now to be through dangerous. By way of comparison, a person can accumulate 30,000 volts on their body in walking across a synthetic carpet. Discharging it stings, but won't kill you. A 1-pint Leyden jar could deliver a more powerful shock, containing about 0.1 joules of energy, but still about 100 times less than what is thought to be hazardous, and thousands of times less than shocks that are routinely delivered by defibrillators to revive people who are in cardiac arrest. According to mainstream science today, the sparks, shocks, and tiny currents used in the 18th century should have had no effects on health, but they did. Imagine you were a patient in 1750, suffering from arthritis. Your electrician would seat you in a chair that had glass legs so that it was well insulated from the ground. This was done so that when you were connected to the friction machine, you would accumulate the electric fluid in your body instead of draining it into the earth. Depending on the philosophy of your electrician, the severity of your disease, and your own tolerance of electricity, there were a number of ways to electrize you. In the electric bath, which was the most gentle, you would simply hold in your hand a rod connected to the prime conductor, and the machine would be cranked continuously for minutes or hours, communicating its charge throughout your body and creating an electrical aura around you. If this was done gently enough, you would feel nothing, just as a person who shuffles their feet on a carpet can accumulate a charge on their body without being aware of it. After you were thus bathed, the machine would be stopped and you might be treated with the electric wind. Electricity discharges most easily from pointed conductors. Therefore, a grounded, pointed metal or wooden wand would be brought toward your painful knee, and you would again feel very little, perhaps the sensation of a small breeze as the charge that had built up in your body slowly dissipated through your knee into the grounded wand. For stronger effect, your electrician might use a wand with a rounded end, and instead of a continuous current, draw actual sparks from your ailing knee. And if your condition was severe, say your leg was paralyzed, you could charge up a small Leyden jar and give your leg a series of strong shocks. Electricity was available in two flavors: positive or vitreous electricity, obtained by rubbing glass, and negative or resinous electricity, originally obtained by rubbing sulfur or various resins. Your electrician would most likely treat you with positive electricity, as it was the variety normally found on the surface of the body in a state of health. The goal of electrotherapy was to stimulate health by restoring the electrical equilibrium of the body where it was out of balance. The idea was certainly not new. In another part of the world, the use of natural electricity had been developed to a fine art over thousands of years. Acupuncture needles, as we will see in Chapter 9, conduct atmospheric electricity into the body, where it travels along precisely mapped pathways, returning to the atmosphere through other needles that complete the circuit. By comparison, electrotherapy in Europe and America, although similar in concept, was an infant science, using instruments that were like sledgehammers. European medicine in the 18th century was full of sledgehammers. If you went to a conventional doctor for your rheumatism, you might expect to be bled, purged, vomited, blistered, and even dosed with mercury. It's easy to understand that going to an electrician instead might seem a very attractive alternative, and it remained attractive until the beginning of the 20th century. After more than half a century of unceasing popularity, electrotherapy fell temporarily out of favor during the early 1800s in reaction to certain cults, one of which had grown up in Europe around Anton Mesmer and his so-called magnetic healing, and another in America around Elisha Perkins and his electric tractors, 3-inch long metallic pencils with which one made passes over a diseased part of the body. Neither man used actual magnets or electricity at all, but they gave both those methods for a while a bad name. By mid-century, electricity was again mainstream, and in the 1880s, 10,000 American physicians were administering it to their patients. Electrotherapy finally fell permanently out of favor in the early 20th century, perhaps one suspects because it was incompatible with what was going on in the world. Electricity was no longer a subtle force that had anything to do with living things. It was a dynamo capable of propelling locomotives and executing prisoners, not curing patients, but sparks delivered by a friction machine a century and a half before the world was wired carried quite different associations. There is no doubt that electricity sometimes cured diseases, both major and minor. The reports of success over almost 2 centuries were sometimes exaggerated, but they are too numerous and often too detailed and well attested to dismiss them all. Even in the early 1800s, when electricity was not in good repute, reports continued to emerge that cannot be ignored. For example, the London Electrical Dispensary between September 29, 1793 and June 4, 1819 admitted 8,686 patients for electrical treatment. Of these, 3,962 were listed as cured, and another 3,308 as relieved when they were discharged, an 84% success rate. Although the main focus of this chapter will be on effects that are not necessarily beneficial, it is important to remember why 18th century society was enthralled with electricity just as we are today. For almost 300 years, the tendency has been to chase its benefits and dismiss its harms. But in the 1700s and 1800s, the daily use of electricity in medicine was a constant reminder. At least electricity was intimately connected with biology. Where in the West, electricity as a biological science remains in its infancy today, and even its cures have been long forgotten. I'll recall just one of them. Making the deaf hear. In 1851, the great neurologist Guillaume Benjamin Duchenne de Boulogne achieved renown for something for which he is least remembered today. As a well-known figure in the history of medicine, he was certainly no quack. He introduced modern methods of physical examination that are still in use. He was the first physician ever to take a biopsy from a living person for the purpose of diagnosis. He published the first accurate clinical description of polio. A number of diseases that he identified are named for him, most notably Duchenne muscular dystrophy. He is remembered for all those things, but in his own time, he was the somewhat unwilling center of attention for his work with the deaf. Duchenne knew the anatomy of the ear in great detail. In fact, it was the purpose of elucidating the function of the nerve called the chorda tympani, which passes through the middle ear, that he asked a few deaf people to volunteer to be the subjects of electrical experiments. The incidental and unexpected improvement in their hearing caused Duchenne to be inundated with requests from within the deaf community to come to Paris for treatments. And so he began to minister to large numbers of people with nerve deafness using the same apparatus that he had designed for his research, which fit snugly into the ear canal and contained a stimulating electrode. His procedure to a modern reader might seem unlikely to have had any effect at all. He exposed his patients to pulses of the feeblest possible current, spaced half a second apart for 5 seconds at a time. Then he gradually increased the current strength, but never to a painful level, and never for more than 5 seconds at a time. And yet by this means he restored good hearing in a matter of days or weeks to a 26-year-old man who had been deaf since age 10, a 21-year-old man who had been deaf since he had measles at age 9, a young woman recently made deaf by an overdose of quinine given for malaria, and numerous others with partial or complete hearing loss. 50 years earlier, in Hever, Germany, an apothecary named Johann Sprenger became famous throughout Europe for a similar reason. Though he was denounced by the director of the Institute for the Deaf and Dumb in Berlin, he was besieged by the deaf themselves with requests for treatment. His results were attested in court documents, and his methods were adopted by contemporary physicians. He himself reported to have fully or partially restored hearing to no less than 40 deaf and hard of hearing individuals, including some deaf from birth. His methods, like Duchenne's, were disarmingly simple and gentle. He made the current weaker or stronger according to the sensitivity of his patient, and each treatment consisted of brief pulses of electricity spaced 1 second apart for a total of 4 minutes per ear. The electrode was placed on the tragus, the flap of cartilage in front of the ear, for 1 minute, inside the ear canal for 2 minutes, and on the mastoid process behind the ear for 1 minute. And 50 years before Spranger, Swedish physician Johan Lindholt, writing from Stockholm, reported the full or partial restoration of hearing during a 2-month period to a 57-year-old man who had been deaf for 32 years, a youth of 22 whose hearing loss was recent, a 7-year-old girl born deaf, a youth of 29 hard of hearing since age 11, and a man with hearing loss and tinnitus of the left ear. All patients, wrote Lindholt, were treated with gentle electricity, either the simple current or the electric wind. Lindholt in 1752 was using a friction machine. Half a century later, Spranger gave galvanic currents from an electric pile for a runner of today's batteries. Half a century after that, Duchenne used alternating current from an induction coil. British surgeon Michael Boehm, similarly successful, used a friction machine in the 1810s and galvanic currents later on. What they all had in common was the insistence on keeping their treatments brief, simple, and painless. Seeing and tasting electricity. Aside from attempting to cure deafness, blindness, and other diseases, early electricians were intensely interested in whether electricity could be directly perceived by the 5 senses, another question about which modern engineers have no interest, and modern doctors have no knowledge, but whose answer is relevant to every modern person who suffers from electrical sensitivity. When he was still in his early 20s, the future explorer Alexander von Humboldt lent his own body to the elucidation of this mystery. It would be several years before he left Europe on the long voyage that was to propel him far of the Orinoco River and the top of Mount Chimborazo, collecting plants as he went, making systematic observations of the stars and the earth and the cultures of Amazonian peoples. Half a century would pass before he would begin work on his 5-volume Cosmos, as an attempt to unify all existing scientific knowledge. But as a young man, supervising mining operations in the Bayreuth district of Bavaria, the central question of his day occupied his spare time. Is electricity really the life force? People were asking. This question, gnawing gently at the soul of Europe since the days of Isaac Newton, had suddenly become insistent, forcing itself out of the lofty realms of philosophy and into dinner-time discussions around the tables of ordinary people whose children would have to live with the chosen answer. The electric battery, which produced a current from the contact of dissimilar metals, had just been invented in Italy. Its implications were huge. Friction machines, bulky, expensive, unreliable, subject to atmospheric conditions, might no longer be necessary. Telegraph systems already designed by a few visionaries might now be practical, and questions about the nature of the electric fluid might come closer to being answered. In the early 1790s, Humboldt drew himself into the research with enthusiasm. He wished, among other things, to determine whether he could perceive the new form of electricity with his own eyes, ears, nose, and taste buds. Others were doing similar experiments. Alessandro Volta in Italy, George Hunter and Richard Fowler in England, Christopher Prof in Germany, Peter Abildgaard in Denmark, but none more thoroughly or diligently than Humboldt. Consider that today we are accustomed to handling 9-volt batteries with our hands without a thought. Consider that millions of us are walking around with silver and zinc as well as gold, copper, and other metals in the fillings in our mouths. Then consider the following experiment of Humboldt's using a single piece of zinc and one of silver that produced an electric tension of about 2 volt. A large hunting dog, naturally lazy, very patiently let a piece of zinc be applied against his palate and remain perfectly tranquil, while another piece of zinc was placed in contact with the first piece and with his tongue. But scarcely one touched his tongue with the silver, then he showed his aversion in a humorous manner. He contracted his upper lip convulsively and let himself for a very long time. It sufficed afterwards to show him the piece of zinc, to remind him of the impression he had experienced, and to make him angry. The ease with which electricity can be perceived and the variety of the sensations would be a revelation to most doctors today. When Humboldt touched the top of his own tongue with the piece of zinc and its point with the piece of silver, the taste was strong and bitter. When he moved the piece of silver underneath, his tongue burned. Moving the zinc further back and the silver forward made his tongue feel cold, and when the zinc was moved even further back, he became nauseous and sometimes vomited, which never happened if the two metals were the same. The sensations always occurred as soon as the zinc and silver pieces were placed in metallic contact with each other. A sensation of sight was just as easily elicited by 4 different methods, using the same 1-volt battery by applying the silver armature on one moistened eyelid and the zinc on the other, or one in a nostril and the other on an eye, or one on the tongue and one on an eye, or even one on the tongue and one against the upper gums. In each case, at the moment the two metals touched each other, Humboldt saw a flash of light. If he repeated the experiment too many times, his eyes became inflamed. In Italy, Volta, the inventor of the electric battery, succeeded in eliciting a sensation of sound, not with one pair of metals, but with 30 attached to electrodes in each ear. With the metals he originally used in his pile, using water as an electrolyte, this may have been about 20-volt battery. Volta heard only a cracking sound, which could have been a mechanical effect on the bones of his middle ears, and he did not repeat the experiment, fearing that the shock to his brain might be dangerous. It remained for German physician Rudolf Brenner 70 years later, using more refined equipment and smaller currents to demonstrate actual effects on the auditory nerve, as we will see in chapter 15. Speeding up the heart and slowing it down. Up the heart and slowing it down. Back in Germany, Humboldt, armed with the same single pieces of zinc and silver, turned his attention next to the heart. Together with his older brother Wilhelm, and supervised by well-known physiologists, Humboldt removed the heart of a fox and prepared one of its nerve fibers so that the armatures could be applied to it without touching the heart itself. At each contact with the metals, the pulsations of the heart were clearly changed. The speed, but especially their force and their elevation were augmented, he recorded. The brothers next experimented on frogs, lizards, and toads. If the dissected heart beat 21 times in a minute, after being galvanized, it beat 38 to 42 times in a minute. If the heart had stopped beating for 5 minutes, it restarted immediately upon contact with the two metals. Together with a friend in Leipzig, Humboldt stimulated the heart of a carp that had almost stopped beating, pulsing only once every 4 minutes. After massaging, the heart proved to have no effect. Galvanization restored the rate to 35 beats per minute. The two friends kept the heart beating for almost a quarter of an hour by repeated stimulation with a single pair of dissimilar metals. On another occasion, Humboldt even managed to revive a dying linnet that was lying feet up, eyes closed on its back, unresponsive to the prick of a pin. I hastened to place a small plate of zinc in its beak and a small piece of silver in its rectum, he wrote, and I immediately established a communication between the two metals with an iron rod. What was my astonishment when at the moment of contact the bird opened its eyes, raised itself on its feet and beat its wings. It breathed again for 6 or 8 minutes and then calmly died. Nobody proved that a 1-volt battery could restart a human heart, but scores of observers before Humboldt had reported that electricity increased the human pulse rate, knowledge that is not possessed by doctors today. German physicians Christian Gottlieb Kratzestein and Karl Abraham Gerhard, German physicists Celestin Stenglener, Swiss physicist Jean Jalabert, French physicians Francois Boissier de Sauvage de la Croix, Pierre Maudoud de la Vanrenne, and Jean-Baptiste Bonnefoy, French physicist Joseph Sigo de la Font, and Italian physicians Eusebio Squario and Giovan Giuseppe Verratti were just a few of the observers who reported that the electric bath increased the pulse rate by anywhere from 5 to 30 beats per minute when positive electricity was used. Negative electricity had the opposite effect. In 1785, Dutch pharmacist William van Barneveld conducted 169 trials on 43 of his patients, men, women, and children aged 9 to 60, finding an average 5% increase in the pulse rate when the person was bathed with positive electricity and a 3% decrease in the pulse rate when the person was bathed with negative electricity. When positive sparks were drawn, the pulse increased by 20%. But these were only averages. No two individuals reacted the same to electricity. No person's pulse always increased from 60 to 90 beats per minute. Another's always doubled. Another's pulse became much slower. Another reacted not at all. Some of von Barneveld's subjects reacted in a manner opposite to the majority. A negative charge always accelerated their pulse, while a positive charge slowed it down. Stupidimento. Observations of these kinds came quickly and abundantly, so that by the end of the 18th century a basic body of knowledge had been built up about the effects of the electric fluid, usually the positive variety, on the human body. It increased both the pulse rate, as we have seen, and the strength of the pulse. It augmented all of the secretions of the body. Electricity caused salivation and made tears to flow and sweat to run. It caused the secretion of earwax and nasal mucus. It made gastric juice flow, stimulating the appetite. It made milk to be let down and menstrual blood to issue. It made people urinate copiously and move their bowels. Most of these actions were useful in electrotherapy and would continue to be so until the early 20th century. Other effects were purely unwanted. Electrification almost always caused dizziness and sometimes a sort of mental confusion, or istupidimento, as the Italians called it. It commonly produced headaches, nausea, weakness, fatigue, and heart palpitations. Sometimes it caused shortness of breath, coughing, or asthma-like wheezing. It often caused muscle and joint pains and sometimes mental depression. Although electricity usually caused the bowels to move, often with diarrhea, repeated electrification could result in constipation. Electricity caused both drowsiness and insomnia. Humboldt, in experiments on himself, found that electricity increased blood flow from wounds and caused serum to flow copiously out of blisters. Gerard divided 1 pound of fleshy drawn blood into 2 equal parts, placed them next to each other, and electrified one of them. The electrified blood took longer to clot. Antoine Thurlayer-Platel, pharmacist at the Hôtel Dieu, the famous hospital in Paris, agreeing saying that electricity is contraindicated in cases of hemorrhage. Consistent with this are numerous reports of nosebleeds from electrification. Wengler and his wife, as already mentioned, got nosebleeds from the shock of a Leyden jar. In the 1790s, Scottish physician and anatomist Alexander Monro, who is remembered for discovering the function of the lymphatic system, got nosebleeds from just a 1-volt battery whenever he tried to elicit the sensation of light in his eyes. Dr. Monro was so excitable by galvanism that he bled from the nose when having the zinc very gently inserted in his nasal fossa. He put it in contact with an armature applied to his tongue. The hemorrhage always took place at the moment when the lights appeared. This was reported by Humboldt. In the early 1800s, Conrad Quinzel in Stockholm reported that galvanism frequently caused nosebleeds. Abe Nollet proved that at least one of these affects, perspiration, occurred merely from being in an electric field. Actual contact with the friction machine wasn't even necessary. He had electrified cats, pigeons, several kinds of songbirds, and finally human beings. In carefully controlled, repeatable experiments accompanied by modern-looking data tables, he had demonstrated measurable weight loss in all of his electrified subjects due to an increase in evaporation from the skin. He had even electrified 500 houseflies in a gauze-covered jar for 4 hours and found that they too had lost extra weight, 4 grains more than the non-electrified counterparts in the same amount of time. Then Nollet had the idea to place his subjects on the floor underneath the electrical metal cage instead of in it, and they still lost as much and even a bit more weight than when they were electrified themselves. Nolan had also observed an acceleration in the growth of seedlings sprouted in electrified pots. This too occurred when the pots were only placed on the floor beneath. Finally, wrote Nollet, I made a person sit for 5 hours on a table near the electrified metal cage. This young woman lost 4.5 grams more weight than when she had actually been electrified herself. Nollet was thus the first person back in 1753 to report significant biological effects from exposure to a DC electric field, the kind of field that, according to mainstream science today, has no effect whatsoever. His experiment was later replicated using a bird by Steglerner, professor of physics at the University of Ingolstadt, Bavaria, with similar results. Table 1 lists the effects on humans reported by most early electricians of an electric charge or small currents of DC electricity. Electrically sensitive people today will recognize most, if not all, of them.